The tide was out, and the smell of low water always got into everything, mud and creosote and the faint copper tang of old boat hardware. I was down at the far slip, running a thumb along a scarf joint I'd glued the day before, checking it hadn't crept overnight, when my boot caught a soft plank and I went down hard on one knee. Nothing broke. I sat there a second, cursing the board, made a mental note to replace it before somebody else went down worse than I had, and got back to work. That was it. That was the whole event. A bad plank, a bruised knee, 20 seconds of my Tuesday. I didn't think about it again until 11 days later, when a boat I'd built for a somewhat trusting man from when a Cobia County deputy walked down my dock in a pressed uniform and asked if I was Louisa Marchetti. I said I was, and he handed me an envelope like it might bite him. I want to say I felt something dramatic in that moment, dread, a cold drop in my stomach, but honestly what I felt first was irritation. I had a hull to fare before the epoxy kicked past workable, and whatever this was, it was going to eat my afternoon. I actually asked the deputy if he could give me the short version so I could get back to the boat. He didn't quite meet my eyes. "Ma'am, I'd just read it," he said, and left. I read it standing at the workbench, still holding a sanding block in my other hand. It was a petition. An emergency one, filed in the probate division, asking the court to appoint a temporary guardian over my person and my financial affairs. Effective immediately, pending a full hearing in 3 weeks. The petitioner was my son-in-law, Grant Ashford. The grounds were laid out in careful, bloodless legal language: a documented fall resulting in probable head trauma, a subsequent psychiatric evaluation revealing significant cognitive decline, and a pattern of erratic financial decision-making that put the boatyard and its assets at risk. Attached was the evaluation. 4 pages, letterhead from a practice I'd never heard of, a name at the bottom, Dr. Eleanor Voss, and a narrative describing a woman I didn't recognize. Disorientation. Difficulty with names. An incident, described in some detail, where I had reportedly wandered onto the pier at night and fallen into the water. Requiring a neighbor to pull me out. I read that paragraph 3 times. I have lived on this water for 41 years. I know exactly where every soft plank on my own dock is, in the dark, in fog, in my sleep. I did not fall into the marsh. I did not have a neighbor haul me out of the water. The only fall I'd had in the last month was the one on Tuesday, the one that put a bruise the size of a plum on my kneecap and nothing else. Somebody had taken a true, small, forgettable thing and grown a lie around it like a pearl around grit. I set the sanding block down very carefully, because my hands had started to want to shake and I did not care for that. My daughter's husband had petitioned a court to take over my life using a medical exam I had never sat for. Describing an accident that never happened, on a date I could account for down to the hour. I want to tell you I called Danielle first. I didn't. Danielle is my daughter, and I have spent 20 years working to be less of a stranger to her than I was when she was young, and some part of me, some old, stupid, hopeful part, still wanted to believe that whatever this was, she didn't know about it. So instead of calling her, I sat down on the upturned bucket I use as a stool at that bench, and I read the document again, this time the way I used to read a fraud file. Not as a mother. As what I used to be, before the boatyard, before Charlie died and left me this place, an investigator. 22 years finding the exact spot where somebody's story didn't match the world. The exam date was a Thursday, 3 weeks back. 6 in the evening, at an address in North Charleston I'd never been to in my life. On that Thursday, at that hour, I had been 40 miles offshore, aboard the research vessel Marisol, hauling sediment cores for a graduate student project I'd volunteered boat time for, my own boat, my own hands on the winch, 5 other people who could put me on that exact stretch of water. I remembered it specifically because the wind had come up out of the southeast right at dusk and we'd had to reef down hard to get back in before the swell built. I remembered it the way you remember a day that made your shoulders ache. Whoever Dr. Eleanor Voss was, she had not evaluated me in North Charleston on that Thursday evening, because I had not been within 40 miles of North Charleston on that Thursday evening. I called Danielle then, and my voice must have sounded normal, because she answered the way she always does, half laughing, mid-errand. "Hey, Mom, can it wait? I'm at the—Did Grant tell you he filed something with the court about me?" the silence on the other end went on a beat too long. Not the silence of somebody hearing news. The silence of somebody deciding what to say. "Mom," she said finally, "careful," he said it was, a precaution. "After you fell." He said the doctor was worried. "What doctor, Danielle? What doctor did you take me to?" Another pause. "The one Grant set up." "I didn't, I wasn't in the room. He said you didn't want me fussing. I have interviewed enough people across enough desks to know the sound of somebody repeating a script they've been handed and haven't yet noticed is a script. My daughter did not sound like a woman lying to me. She sounded like a woman standing in the doorway of something she hadn't looked inside yet. "I need you to do something for me," I said. "Don't tell Grant we talked." "Not yet. Just, give me a few days." "Mom, you're scaring me." "Good," I said, and I meant it kindly. "Stay scared until you know exactly what you're scared of." After we hung up, I sat with the petition open on the bench under the shop light, and I did the thing that's kept me sane for 2 decades of finding what people would rather I didn't. I got a legal pad. I wrote down the doctor's name, the practice address, the license number printed at the bottom of the letterhead in 8-point type that somebody had clearly hoped I wouldn't bother to check. It took 4 minutes on the state medical board's public license lookup to find nothing. Not a suspended license. Not an expired one. Nothing. No Eleanor Voss, psychiatrist, had ever been licensed to practice in the state of South Carolina, under that name, under any spelling of that name I could think to try. The tide was still going out. I could hear it working against the pilings under the shop floor, that long patient suck and drag it does twice a day, wearing everything down a little at a time, so slow you'd never see it happen if you didn't know to look. I looked at the blank space where a real doctor's credentials should have been, and I understood, with the kind of clean, cold clarity I used to feel right before I closed a case, that my son-in-law had not made a mistake. He had built something. And whatever he'd built it for, it wasn't finished yet. A hearing meant there was still a next step, still more he needed from me than just a signature on a fall that never happened. I picked up the phone again. Not Danielle this time. I still had Priya Anand's number memorized, 7 years after we'd last worked a case together, because some numbers you just don't let go of. Priya Anand picked up on the second ring, the way she always had, like she'd been waiting by the phone for a case worth answering for. "Lou Marchetti," she said. "It's been what, 7 years? You still owe me a bottle of something expensive from that marine cargo case in Savannah." "I need a favor first," I said. "Then I'll buy you the whole liquor store." She went quiet in the particular way she used to go quiet across a conference table, right before she asked the question that actually mattered. "What kind of favor?" I told her. "Not everything." I wasn't ready to say the word guardianship out loud yet, like saying it made it more real than the paper already had, but enough. A son-in-law. A psychiatric evaluation from a doctor who didn't exist. A filing that wanted a judge to hand him my accounts and my boatyard within 3 weeks. The line stayed silent long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Say the doctor's name again," she said finally. "Eleanor Voss, and you checked the board yourself before you called me." "For minutes." "Nothing, okay." I heard something shift on her end, a chair, a laptop lid. 22 years and Priya still did that thing where the softness in her voice disappeared the instant a case became real. "I'm not going to pretend this is a simple one, Lou. If he's smart enough to fabricate a licensed evaluation, he's smart enough that his finances aren't going to look dirty on the surface. I'll need everything you can get me. Bank relationships, if you know them. Anything with his name on a loan, a lease, a personal guarantee. And I need you to understand something before I start. Go ahead, if I find what I think I'm going to find, you're not going to like how it explains this." I told her I already didn't like it, and that not liking it wasn't going to stop me from wanting to know. She said she'd start quiet, working her old contacts at 2 clearinghouses who owed her favors from before she went independent. And that quiet meant slow. I told her slow was fine. The hearing wasn't for 3 weeks. I had time to be patient, as long as I didn't spend it being stupid. "One more thing," she said. "Don't do anything that tips him off that you're not exactly the woman in that evaluation. Whatever he thinks you are right now, confused, scared, cooperative, stay that woman on the phone with him. The moment he thinks you're digging, he stops being careless. I told her I'd been playing that particular role most of my adult life, one way or another, and she laughed, short and dry, and told me she'd call when she had something real. After I hung up, I went and did the thing that had kept my hand steady through worse nights than this one. I got out the ledgers. I still keep the boatyard books by hand. In a set of green cloth-bound volumes I buy a case of at a time from a stationer in Beaufort who probably thinks I'm the last customer he has for them. Charlie used to tease me about it, told me I was the only marine business in 3 counties still doing longhand in an age of spreadsheets, but the truth was simpler than nostalgia. When my hands are moving in straight columns, my mind can work on something else entirely. I sat at the workbench that night with the ledger open to a half-finished entry on epoxy costs for the Bertram restoration, and while my pen moved through numbers I already knew by heart, the rest of me turned the petition over and over. Looking for the seam, Danielle called before I'd finished the page. "Grant wants to do dinner Thursday," she said. "He feels bad about how fast everything's moved. He wants to explain it to you properly, in person, not over the phone through me." I told her that sounded lovely. I meant it to sound like a woman relieved her family was finally paying her some attention. I think it landed, because Danielle's voice warmed up on the other end, relieved in a way that made my chest hurt more than her earlier fear had. "He's not a monster, Mom," she said, unprompted, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. "He panicked. The doctor scared him. He loves you." Whatever this looks like right now, I did not tell her that the doctor did not exist. I was not ready to hand my daughter that particular weight before I understood the shape of it myself, and some old, careful part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades not tipping my hand to a suspect until I had the whole file closed, knew that Danielle's face was the one thing in this that Grant could not fake. If she found out too early and Grant read the change in her, he'd feel the ground shift before I wanted him to. I'd like that, I told her. Thursday's fine. Thursday came in gray and close, the kind of low coastal heat that sits on your shoulders instead of just warming them. Grant showed up at my place at 6 with a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly fuel bill for the whole yard, and a smile that had clearly been rehearsed somewhere between his truck and my front step. "Lou," he said, pulling me into a hug that lasted a half-second too long, like he was checking whether I'd flinch. "I am so sorry about how all this happened. I really am. I should have talked to you myself before any papers went anywhere near a courthouse." I let him see exactly what he expected to see. A tired woman, a little stiff in the shoulders from the fall, grateful for the attention, glad her son-in-law had come to make things right. I asked about the wine. I asked about his current project. A boutique row of short-term rentals he was converting out of an old cannery building downtown, and watched him light up describing granite counters and exposed brick like a man selling a fantasy he needed someone else to believe in as badly as he did. "How's financing on that place going?" I asked. "Easy, the way you'd ask about weather." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone almost before I caught it. "Good," he said. "Really good, actually. Banks love this kind of project right now, boutique hospitality, waterfront access. We're in great shape." Danielle, setting the table behind him, didn't look up, but I saw her shoulders tighten half an inch, the smallest possible flinch. Like she'd heard that particular confidence before and it hadn't held up the last few times either. "We ate. Grant talked. He explained the evaluation the way you'd explain a car accident that wasn't your fault, a specialist Danielle's cousin had recommended, a home visit he'd arranged while I was resting, paperwork he trusted because he didn't know better, an outcome that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Every sentence was built to sound like love wearing a bad decision as a disguise. I nodded in all the right places. I let my eyes go a little distant once, the way a woman recovering from a fall and a shock might, and watched him relax visibly when he saw it, somewhere between the entree and dessert. His phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it, and for just a moment the salesman dropped entirely, a tightness at the jaw, a flick of something close to fear, before he flipped it face down and picked the smile back up like a tool he'd set aside and needed again. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Contractor stuff," he said. "Always something." I believed the lie the way I was supposed to. I did not believe the version of him that had glanced at that screen. Priya called 2 days later, in the flat, careful voice she used when she had something and hadn't decided yet how much of it to say out loud on an open line. I found the Cannery Project's construction loan, she said. It's not with a bank. Whose is it, then? There's a shell entity attached, Coastal Bridge Capital, registered out of a UPS mailbox in Charleston. No banking charter. No FDIC anything. I ran the registered agent and got a name I've seen before, on 2 other deals that went sideways real fast a few years back. Man named Warren Coy, meaning what? Meaning your son-in-law isn't borrowing from an institution, Lou. He's borrowing from a person. And people who lend that way don't file suit when the payments stop. They collect some other way. She paused. I don't have the total yet. It's bigger than one loan. There's at least 2 more entities tied to the same registered agent. And I haven't finished tracing them. Give me another week and I'll have the real number. I sat with the ledger still open in front of me, my pen resting on a column of numbers that no longer meant anything, and understood that whatever fear had put that flicker on Grant's face at my own dinner table, I had just found its name. The name stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. Warren Coy. I turned it over in the ledger's margin without writing it down, the way you handle something you don't want fingerprints on, but an alibi doesn't build itself while you're staring at a name, and I still had 3 weeks until a judge in Beaufort County decided whether I was fit to run my own life. So the next morning, instead of driving into town, I drove out to the university dock where the Marisol had been berthed for the winter, and I climbed aboard to go looking for proof of where I actually was on the night some invented doctor claimed to have looked into my eyes and found me lacking. Dr. Wendell Okafor ran the sediment survey I'd volunteered the Marisol and my own back for, and he still kept his office in the same cramped trailer at the edge of the Marine Sciences Pier, buried under enough paper to make my ledgers look tidy. He didn't ask why I wanted the expedition logs. Scientists rarely question a request for more data. It's the one thing they never think to be suspicious of. You want the AIS track too? He asked, already pulling up a folder on a laptop held together with electrical tape. Automatic identification system. Every research vessel over a certain tonnage broadcasts position, every few minutes, whole time you're underway. Coast Guard keeps it. We keep a copy too, for the grant reports. I told him I wanted everything. Position data. Crew manifest. Time-stamped photographs from the winch deck. He didn't blink, just started printing. What came off that ancient trailer printer over the next 20 minutes was the most beautiful paperwork I believe I have ever held in my hands. A track line of GPS coordinates, logged every 4 minutes, showing the Marisol 41 miles off the coast starting at 2 in the afternoon and continuing well past midnight. The exact Thursday in question, the same date printed on the fraudulent evaluation sitting in my kitchen drawer. A crew manifest with 6 names on it, including mine, each of us signed in and out by hand at the dock office before we ever left the slip. And photographs. Okafor's graduate student had documented every core sample with a timestamp burned into the corner of the frame, and there I was in 4 of them, foul weather gear zipped to the chin, hauling a core barrel up over the rail while the light behind me went from gray afternoon to black night. At 6 in the evening, the hour the evaluation swore I'd been sitting across a desk from a psychiatrist in North Charleston, I was standing on an open deck 40 miles from cell coverage. Hauling mud up from the bottom of the Atlantic with 5 witnesses watching me do it, I sat in my truck in the Marine Sciences parking lot for a long moment with that stack of paper on the passenger seat, and for the first time since the deputy had walked down my dock, I let myself feel something other than controlled. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was closer to what I used to feel closing a file I knew was airtight, a clean, quiet certainty that whatever came next, this particular lie could not survive contact with a courtroom. Priya called that evening while I was still sorting the printouts into a folder I intended to hand to no one but my own attorney, and not one day before the hearing forced my hand. I need to tell you about a phone call I got, she said, and something in her voice made me set the folder down. Go on. A man named Desmond Reyes called my office line. Said he works with Grant. Junior partner on the Cannery Project, handles permitting and some of the investor relations. He didn't want to talk on his cell. Called from a payphone outside a gas station, if you can believe those still exist. What did he want? He wants to talk to you. Or to somebody, anyway. He wouldn't say much on the phone, kept saying he didn't want to get anybody in trouble, including himself. But he said two things I wrote down word for word. He said Grant had him prepare investor disclosure documents for the cannery project that don't match the loan structure Grant actually signed. And he said Grant's been, quote, acting like a man who thinks people are following him. I asked her what she made of it. I think he's scared and guilty and doesn't know which one is louder, she said. People like that either go quiet forever or they call back. I told him I'd passed the message along to a family member handling some unrelated legal matters. I didn't use your name. He called back 2 days later, not to Priya's office this time, but to a number she'd given him that routed through an answering service with no name attached to it. I listened to the recording that evening in my kitchen, the same table where I'd first read the petition, Grant's careful sentences about the fall folded up somewhere in a drawer beneath the current mess of Priya's spreadsheets. Desmond's voice was young, tight, the voice of a man rehearsing a sentence he'd been building in his head for a week before he found the nerve to say it out loud. I don't know exactly who you are, he said, and I'm not asking. I just need somebody besides me to know some of this, because I think it's gotten past the point where staying quiet is the safe option. He talked for almost 11 minutes. Most of it was the ordinary, tedious anatomy of a company coming apart, invoices that didn't reconcile, a construction draw schedule that kept sliding, a silent investor group Grant had stopped returning calls to. But near the end, his voice dropped the careful, rehearsed quality and started sounding like a man just talking. There's this one thing that's been eating at me, he said. About 6 weeks back, Grant had me clear his calendar for an afternoon, no explanation, just told me to push everything. I only know where he went because I saw the confirmation email open on his laptop when I brought him a set of permit revisions. It was a meeting with an insurance broker. High net worth underwriting, some boutique shop out of Charleston I'd never heard of before or since. I sat very still at my kitchen table, one hand flat on the folder of Marisol printouts, listening to a stranger's voice describe a meeting I hadn't known existed until that exact moment. I didn't think anything of it at first, Desmond went on. Figured maybe it was business insurance, keyman stuff, something for the LLC. But the timing's what got to me. That meeting happened the same week his lawyer filed something in probate court. I only found that out after, when I heard secondhand what was going on with Grant's mother-in-law. I don't know what those two things have to do with each other. I just know they happened the same week, and Grant's never once mentioned either one of them to me since, and a man doesn't go that quiet about ordinary business insurance. The recording ended there, with Desmond saying he'd call again if he decided he could stomach saying more, and asking, in a voice that sounded almost like a child asking permission, whether he was doing the right thing. I sat with that question a long time after the tape stopped playing. An insurance broker, the same week the petition was drafted, and a young man scared enough to call a stranger from a payphone rather than say a word of it inside his own office. Whatever Grant had bought that week, it wasn't ordinary, and it wasn't for the business. The name of that Charleston brokerage sat in my kitchen for 2 more days before Priya called back with a shape to put around it. Ashford didn't buy Keyman Insurance, she said, and I could hear her choosing each word like she was setting it down on glass. He bought a policy on you, Lou. $2.2 million, term life, application filed the same week. Desmond says he saw that confirmation email. I have the broker's name off the state insurance filing. I have the underwriting file number. I don't have the actual policy documents yet, those aren't public, but I have enough breadcrumbs that I know exactly what to ask my contact at the State Insurance Commission to pull. I sat with that for a moment, turning it the way you'd turn a strange fitting you'd found in an old boat's bilge, trying to work out what system it belonged to. How does a man take out a policy on his wife's mother without her signing anything? The same way he got a psychiatric evaluation with your name on it, Priya said. If he's already forging your signature for the court petition, forging it for an insurance application is the same afternoon's work. Insurers don't verify signatures the way a bank does. They verify premiums. As long as the check clears, most of them don't ask hard questions until somebody dies. She called again 4 days later, this time with the actual underwriting file, obtained through a channel she described only as someone who owes me from the Savannah days, and asked me not to ask further about. I sat at my kitchen table with the pages spread in front of me the way I used to spread hull damage photographs for an adjuster. Looking for the pattern before I looked at any single piece, the policy itself was ordinary enough on its face. 2.2 million, term life, premiums current, beneficiary listed as a holding entity. I recognized immediately as one of the shell companies tied to Grant's cannery project. It was the rider attached to the base policy that made my hands go still over the paper. It was a standard accelerated processing clause, the kind insurers attach to policies on older applicants to keep claims from dragging through months of paperwork when a death is unremarkable. If the insured dies of natural causes while under the documented care of a licensed medical or custodial facility, with a treating physician of record signing the death certificate, the claim is expedited, funds released in as little as 10 business days, no independent investigation triggered. If the death occurs anywhere else, at home, unsupervised, or without a physician's signature in hand, the same claim can sit under review for 6 months or longer while the insurer's own investigators satisfy themselves there's no fraud. I read that clause 3 times before I understood what it actually meant, and once I understood it, I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. Grant hadn't picked a name off a hospice brochure to make my forced placement look plausible to a judge. He'd picked it because the clause required a death that looked routine, supervised, medically unremarkable, and an unlicensed facility with no real oversight was exactly the kind of place that could produce a clean-looking death certificate without anyone ever asking why an otherwise healthy 68-year-old woman's heart had given out 3 weeks into her stay. I picked up my own copy of the guardianship petition, the one Priya's attorney friend had helped me annotate line by line in the weeks since the deputy first walked it down my dock, and turned to the section I'd read past too quickly the first time. Buried in the proposed care plan, in language dense enough that I'd skimmed it as boilerplate, was the name of a facility. Cypress Landing Recovery and Respite. Out past Walterboro, on a stretch of county road I'd never had reason to drive, I searched the state health department's public licensing database that night, the same way I'd checked the psychiatrist's credentials weeks before. Cypress Landing held something called a provisional respite designation, a category, I learned after an hour of reading regulatory language meant to be read by no one, that exempted a facility from the inspection schedule required of a full licensed nursing home as long as it kept fewer than a certain number of residents and didn't advertise itself as providing medical care. It had been open 4 years. It had never once appeared on the state's inspection calendar. It had 2 complaints on file, both dismissed for lack of a formal investigator to follow up, both years old, both involving a resident who died within a month of intake. I sat with that number for a long time. 2. I thought about Danielle then, the way I try not to let myself think about her too often when I'm doing this kind of work, because it slows my hands. She still didn't know any of this. She knew her husband had panicked, had done something reckless with a doctor's evaluation, had scared her badly enough that she'd called me shaking that first week. She did not know he had priced my death at $2.2 million and picked the exact address where it would happen cleanly enough to collect. I understood, sitting there, that whatever small hope I'd been carrying, some quiet, foolish corner of myself that still wanted this to end with Grant confessing, apologizing, finding some way back to being merely a desperate man who'd made one terrible choice, was gone. A man who panics forges a signature. A man who panics steals money. A man who researches accelerated payout clauses and shops for a facility with no inspection history is not panicking anymore. He is planning. I called Priya back that same night. I need you to stop building the case for a minute, I said, and start building something else. Go ahead, you told me weeks ago the cannery project has silent investors. And that some of them are getting nervous about Grant not returning calls. I want you to find out exactly who they are, and I want you to find out what it would cost to buy their positions. There was a pause on the line, the particular pause Priya does when she's already 3 steps ahead in deciding whether to say so. You're not talking about due diligence anymore, she said. You're talking about taking the company. I'm talking about owning the ground he's standing on before he finds out I know what Cypress Landing actually is, I said. He built a machine to profit from my death. I want to own every gear in it before that machine ever gets the chance to turn. Priya's office smelled like new carpet and old coffee. And I'd spent enough hours there over the past 10 days that the receptionist had stopped asking me to sign in. 3 of the 4 silent investors sold, she said, sliding a folder across her desk. The 4th held out for 2 extra points on the price, but he folded yesterday afternoon once he understood I wasn't going to negotiate a 3rd time. As of this morning, your holding company controls 58% of the LLC that owns the cannery project. Grant doesn't know. None of the paperwork routes through anything with your name on it. I looked down at the signature line waiting for me, my own name in blue ink instead of Harrison's forged version of it, and felt none of the triumph I might have expected. Just a kind of grim, necessary wait, the feeling of setting the last brace on a hull before you know whether it'll hold. Once this is signed, Priya said, watching me the way she used to watch a client right before they committed to a subrogation claim they couldn't walk back, you own the company he's been trying to save. If he defaults on anything, his personal guarantee, a supplier payment, anything, you're the one who gets to decide what happens to him. That's not investigation anymore, Lou. That's leverage. I'm aware of what it is. I signed it. The pen moved easy across the paper, easier than I expected for something that felt, underneath, like closing a door I couldn't open again. I drove home along the causeway with the windows down, the marsh grass bending gold in the late afternoon light, and I didn't feel like a woman who'd just taken a man's company out from under him. I felt like a woman running out the clock on a hearing that was now only 6 days away, hoping the ground I'd bought would hold long enough to matter. Danielle called that night, and the first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not her usual quiet, the comfortable kind we'd built up slowly over the past few weeks of careful, half-honest phone calls. This was a different silence, the kind that has something behind it trying to get out. Mom, she said. Can you come over? Just, right now. If you can. I didn't ask questions on the phone. I drove straight to the house Grant had bought them 3 years back, a nice colonial 2 streets off the water that had always struck me as slightly too large for the 2 of them, and found Danielle sitting on the front steps in the dark, her arms wrapped around her knees like she was cold in 70-degree weather. She had a folder in her lap. I recognized the kind, the sturdy accordion-style people use for tax records, and I recognized, with a cold drop in my stomach, that it was not the kind of folder a woman finds by accident. I was looking for our marriage certificate, she said, before I'd even sat down beside her. For the passport renewal. I know exactly where he keeps it, Mom. I've pulled that folder out a dozen times over the years. Except this time there was something else in with it. Something I don't think he meant to leave there. She opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady, and pulled out a single stapled document. I didn't need to read it closely to know what it was. I'd already seen a copy in Priya's files 2 weeks ago. It's a life insurance application, Danielle said, her voice climbing towards something brittle. On you. $2.2 million. Dated the same week he had you served with that guardianship petition. Mom, I don't. I looked at the signature line. That's not your handwriting. I've watched you sign 100 checks. That's not you. I sat very still on the cold concrete step, doing the arithmetic I hadn't wanted to do yet. How much did she know, and how much was still mine to decide when and how she learned? She had the policy. She didn't have the accelerated payout clause, or the name Cypress Landing, or what that unlicensed status actually meant for a woman my age left unsupervised in a place built to produce clean, unremarkable death certificates. She had enough to be frightened. She did not yet have enough to understand exactly what she should be frightened of. Danielle, I said carefully. How long have you known this was in there? Since about 4 o'clock. Her voice cracked on the last word. I've been sitting here for 3 hours trying to figure out what it means, and every single thing I come up with is worse than the last one. I called the broker's office listed on the letterhead. I told them I was you. They wouldn't confirm or deny anything, obviously, but the woman on the phone got very quiet when I gave her the policy number, and quiet like that doesn't happen over routine paperwork. She turned to face me fully then, and in the porch light I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in a very long time. Not since she was 19 and had come to me after finding out a college boyfriend had been lying to her about something small and stupid. The exact particular look of a person watching the floor of their own life give way beneath them. Why would he take out a policy on you and forge your signature on a guardianship filing in the same week, she said, and it wasn't really a question, it was her thinking out loud, testing the shape of a thing she already half understood and didn't want to. Mom. What has he been planning to do? I could have told her everything right there on the steps. Part of me wanted to, the part of me that had spent 3 weeks watching my daughter defend a man I already knew was capable of watching me die and calling it a solution. But I still didn't have the hearing won. If Danielle went home tonight and confronted Grant with what she knew. If her horror made her careless, if Grant caught even a glimpse of how close the walls had actually closed in around him, he still had 6 days to panic in a direction I couldn't predict. A cornered man with a hearing bearing down on him and a wife who suddenly knows part of the truth is not a stable variable. I needed him calm and arrogant until the moment it no longer mattered whether he was either. I don't know exactly what he's been planning, I said, which was, in its narrowest legal sense, true. I didn't have Cypress Landing's name from her lips, and I hadn't told her mine. But Danielle, look at me. That is not a normal document for a healthy woman to find in her husband's private files. And it is not something you imagined or misread. Whatever this is, it's real, and it's serious, and you were right to be scared. I don't know who I married, she said, and her voice broke apart on the last word, dissolving into something raw and childlike that I hadn't heard from her since she was small enough to carry. I've been defending him to you for 3 weeks, Mom. I told you he panicked. I told you he loved you. I sat at that dinner table and made excuses for a man who had a $2 million policy on your life sitting in a drawer 8 feet from where we were eating. I put my arm around her, and she let me, which she hadn't done freely and longer than I wanted to admit to myself. I sat there on the cold steps with my daughter shaking against my shoulder, holding proof of a fraction of what her husband had done, and I understood that the decision in front of me wasn't about the hearing anymore, not entirely. It was about whether the woman crying next to me was going to walk into that courtroom as a stranger to what I'd built, or as someone I finally, fully let in. The courthouse in Beaufort County smelled like cold coffee and floor wax, entirely unlike the marsh air I'd breathed every morning for 40 years. I sat on the hard wooden bench outside Courtroom 3 with Danielle beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and neither of us said much. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said on those cold porch steps 4 nights earlier. I had told her everything, in the end. Not because I'd stopped protecting the timeline, but because watching her shake in the dark, holding proof of a fraction of what her husband had done, I understood that keeping her in the dark any longer wasn't protecting the plan anymore. It was just cruelty with a different name. So I'd told her about Cypress Landing, about the accelerated payout clause, about what an unlicensed facility with no inspection history was actually built to produce. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried again. She'd gone very quiet and very still, the way I remembered her going still as a small child right before she made up her mind about something completely. I'm coming to the hearing, she'd said. Not for him. For you. Now she sat beside me in a plain gray dress, her hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles had gone pale, waiting for the bailiff to call our case. Grant arrived 12 minutes late, in a suit that fit a little looser than I remembered from 3 weeks ago, flanked by an attorney who kept glancing at his watch like a man who already suspected his client hadn't told him everything. Grant didn't look at me. He looked, just once, at Danielle, and something crossed his face that might have been hope, and she looked back at him with an expression so flat and so finished that he dropped his eyes to the floor and didn't try again. The judge was a woman named Constance Whitfield, gray-haired, unhurried, the kind of jurist who had clearly sat through a great many manufactured family emergencies and had learned to read the room before she read the file. My attorney, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Elias Cho, stood first. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid the expedition records on the table like a man setting down playing cards he already knew would win the hand. Your Honor, the petition rests entirely on a psychiatric evaluation dated the 14th of last month, allegedly conducted in person at an address in North Charleston, at 6 in the evening. I'd like to enter into evidence the certified satellite tracking log of the research vessel Marisol. Along with a notarized crew manifest and time-stamped photographs, all independently verified by the vessel's operating institution. These records place my client 41 miles offshore, entirely outside cellular range, at the exact hour this evaluation claims to have occurred. Judge Whitfield took her time with the pages. I watched Grant's attorney lean over to whisper something urgent, and I watched Grant not respond at all, his eyes fixed on some point on the table in front of him that wasn't actually there. "Counsel," the judge said finally, looking up over her glasses at Grant's side of the room, "do you have any explanation for how your client's mother-in-law was examined in person at an address she could not possibly have been at?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard in 3 weeks of quiet, patient work. "Your Honor," Grant's attorney said, "we'll need a recess to." "You'll have your recess," Elias said smoothly, "but before we take one, I think the court should understand why this particular evaluation was fabricated, and why this particular facility was chosen for the proposed placement." He laid down the next document. Cyprus Landing's licensing status. The provisional respite designation. The 2 prior complaints, both involving deaths within a month of intake, both dismissed for lack of a formal investigator to follow up. I watched the judge's face change as she read it, the professional neutrality thinning into something colder. "And this," Elias said, laying down the 3rd document, "is a term life insurance policy, $2.2 million, taken out on my client 6 weeks before this petition was filed, application signed with a forged signature, beneficiary a holding company controlled by the respondent. The policy carries an accelerated processing clause that pays out fastest, and with the least scrutiny, when the insured dies of natural causes under the documented care of an unlicensed custodial facility." Danielle's hand found mine on the bench and gripped it hard enough to hurt. I let her. Grant's attorney had gone very still beside him, the particular stillness of a man realizing he'd walked into court representing someone he no longer fully understood. "There's one more matter, Your Honor," Elias said, and I felt the room shift again, the way a hull shifts when the tide finally turns. "The respondent's development company, the entity his motive here was built to protect, is currently insolvent. 6 weeks ago, my client's holding entity completed a legal, fully documented acquisition of a controlling 58% stake in that company from its distressed silent investors. Mr. Ashford has, since that date, been asking his own mother-in-law for permission to run his business without knowing it." I watched Grant's face when that landed. Not fury. Not the outrage I might have once expected from him. Just a kind of quiet, total collapse. The air leaving him the way it leaves a hull that's finally taken on more water than it can hold. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He looked, briefly, toward Danielle, and this time he didn't even try to hold her eyes. He just looked down at his own hands on the table, and stayed that way. Judge Whitfield removed her glasses, folded them, and set them down with the deliberate care of someone who had already decided what came next and simply needed a moment to say it correctly. "This petition is dismissed, with prejudice," she said. "I am referring the evaluating physician of record for investigation by the State Medical Board, and I am referring this entire matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of possible fraud, forgery, and elder abuse charges. Mr. Ashford, I would strongly advise retaining separate counsel for whatever comes next, because the interests in this room are no longer aligned." Grant's attorney was already gathering papers with the brisk, unsentimental speed of a man calculating billable hours against a sinking client. Grant sat where he was, motionless, until a bailiff quietly indicated it was time to clear the courtroom for the next case. Danielle didn't go to him. She stood, smoothed the front of her gray dress, and walked out beside me instead, her arm looped through mine the way it hadn't been since she was small enough that I still had to slow my stride to match hers. We didn't speak much in the parking lot. There wasn't a clean sentence for what either of us was feeling, and I'd learned enough in 3 weeks not to reach for one that wasn't true yet. I drove home along the causeway with the windows down, the marsh grass bending in the late afternoon wind, gulls working the tide flats the same as they had every single day of my life on this water, entirely unbothered by anything that had just happened in a fluorescent courtroom 40 minutes inland. There was no black town car waiting. There was no audience to perform my vindication for. There was just the boatyard, weathered and familiar, the smell of varnish and brine drifting up from the shop the moment I stepped out of the truck. Desmond was sitting on the tailgate of his own truck near the shed, waiting, the way he'd taken to doing most afternoons since the whole thing had started, half out of loyalty to the truth and half, I suspected, out of not having anywhere else steadier to be. "How'd it go?" he asked, though I could tell from his face he already knew, or at least knew enough. "It's over," I said. "The petition." "Not everything else," he nodded slowly, hands jammed in his pockets, looking past me at the boatyard like he was seeing it for the first time as something other than a place he'd only ever visited to pass along nervous, second-hand information from a payphone. "So what happens now?" he said. "With the company." "With all of it." I looked past him at the hull of the old wooden sloop I'd been meaning to get back to for 3 weeks, sitting up on its blocks exactly where I'd left it the morning the deputy first walked down my dock. "Now," I said, "we get back to work."